Yeah, we're right about that.
Oh, my point is, that's why I was saying. I've got spaces, I guess, somewhere. Just not on the primary. Normally I would go over here, right, and find the edge of it and drag it in and then again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Space. Looks like we're in space.
Well, I can turn on spaces, and I think what I need to do is go back to this, and go to arrangement.
We got it up now.
Like, I don't know what happened. Yeah, I don't want to pull it up. I don't know what happened. Like, maybe we came in and I was trying to find out.
Hey Eugene, could you unmute your mic and say hey, hello, just to get the video to switch here? Thanks.
Hey, Sean, can you hear me?
Oh, we broadcast.
Sean.
Secondary monitor.
Do you want it as a secondary monitor, or do you want it to be?
Yeah, because I want to see my presenter notes on this, you know, but, and then if we started, then let's see if we see it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Absolutely.
Hey, is anyone there on the other side?
That's it. I do have power, right?
Yeah, Sean, can you hear me?
Probably about to run out of power.
Yeah, you're faint.
And what about the sound?
Hey, Chris. So we can hear you guys just fine.
That's all,
Okay.
right? Okay.
Thanks.
You might have to turn up your volume or something, but I'm like 6 inches from the mic.
What about
You
Actually,
sound good.
yeah.
You sound good. It's a bit noisy in here.
Yeah.
have a glass of water?
Oh man, we didn't get a glass of water.
That's okay.
Someone give me a glass of water.
I'm getting over cold.
If something weird happens, just give me a call.
All right. Thanks. Liz just wanted to get your call.
Oh, that's great.
Whenever Liz knows that whenever I say could someone do something,
See, that must,
it's
she's
always
someone,
Liz.
that's her name.
The one designated that should be good.
Okay.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with a little bit of last minute technical tinkering. Are we ready to go? Cool. Excellent. Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce Carla Benston, my dear colleague in the art department.
You guys here?
She is a faculty member in the art department as a painter and also associate member of the environmental studies. The link between those two interests is exactly why she was invited to this class. She has shown widely as a painter, quite well known as an abstract expressionist.
Not expressionist.
As an abstract painter. And then interestingly got really involved and very interested in all the ecological issues, spending many summers down in Costa Rica, Ecuador,
Amazon.
And also teaching a class, actually, which is somewhat parallel in terms of some of the issues to the Machine in the Garden class, in that it looks at art and ecology and the kind of intersection of issues and strategies and what have you. So she's the perfect speaker for this class.
Well, I don't know about that.
And I give you progress.
So, hi, I'm very happy to be here. And, you know, I admit that my relationship to these issues is quite mysterious and becoming less mysterious to me. My path to be more and more involved in environmental issues, both in my work and in my teaching, is complex and something that I really had to find on a personal level. And so, as Colin said, my first confession is that not only am I not, doing overtly environmental work, but I'm actually a painter. And you'll see immediately from my little thing I put together to try to put us in the mood for this that I'm not a digital artist. It's very crude, but let's give it a shot. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous presenting this work because this is brand new stuff for me. These are just some ideas I have for future development. I actually envisioned this as a wall with sounds of, animals around in nature and the eyes looking for them and then picking up on the intruder and looking at the intruder. And so a lot of my work is a journey from these very rarefied, abstract paintings and a desire to understand how we're constituted as both embodied perceivers and how much of that of perception is natural and how much is constructed. And so this is a kind of long-term overarching question. I'm going to start by showing you some of the paintings, hopefully to try to help us to understand how I'm thinking about what I'm doing now. Is it possible to turn out some of these side lights? So, and I'm going to try to go fast and not get too caught up in some of the esoteric stuff around the paintings. But this is a painting that is about midway through from a point about midway through my lecture today, and it's the last painting I did in this format of this round painting. But before I talk about that too much, I want to talk about my relationship to science. So for the past 7 years, I've been hanging out at these biostations with scientists, mostly biologists, at field stations in the Amazon. And my journey there is both a personal and an intellectual one, and I'll tell you little bits of that. But this is so I've started to kind of think about my work to some extent in relationship to how scientists kind of conceptualize their practices. And this is Richard Dawkins, who was a famous evolutionary biologist. And he made this statement: all of us are the products of successful parents. And what that means is basically that we are here because our parents lived long enough, were robust enough to live long enough to reproduce their genes. And they were also, and I hate to tell you this, but sexy enough to attract a partner to reproduce. And so evolutionary theory is really interesting because it embraces both efficiency and sexiness and sensuality, the things that kind of excite our eye, as well as the things that excite our minds. Elizabeth Gross is a feminist theorist who talks about this in a really interesting way. So she talks about how science is, she talks about the world as being constructed basically of chaos, and different disciplinary approaches are kind of methodologies for trying to extract some kind of meaning or order out of this chaos that is the world. But each of them can really only access one kind of knowing, one kind of understanding, one way of relating. So there are opportunities and constraints in each of these disciplines. So science is particularly good at talking about practicalities, things that are applied. It's the kind of efficiency and the precision of the scientific process that allows us to do that. But it doesn't tell us anything about what it means to be embodied, to have a subjective experience of the world, which according to Gross is kind of what art can do, is to tell us not just what is happening, but what it feels like. And after I kind of tell you something about my work, I'd like to actually have a little conversation about what role you think art can play in this environmental crisis. Does it have a role? And then the third kind of methodology would be philosophy, which is a way of organizing our concepts. So I'm very interested in this idea of efficiency, of the practicalities of survival, as well as what Gross describes as this superabundance, this kind of excess that is sexual display. And this is very crazy, but it's very interesting, I think. So evolutionary theory is very messy, right? And if you think, and we tend to emphasize survival. We tend to emphasize this idea of survival of the fittest and not really look at the kind of sexual selection aspect of it. So Ross is looking at this and saying, and for example, she points to these birds called bowerbirds that live in Australia. And these birds put themselves at great risk to attract a mate. So they turn over leaves, they collect beautiful flowers, mostly blue flowers. If they find a scrap of blue, they'll collect it. And they'll make a clearing in front of their nest, and the males do. So the males display, the females choose with most birds. And they put these things out there, in order to draw attention to themselves, in order to basically say, and it's this excessive display. It serves no function at all. It actually, in terms of their survival, it actually puts them at risk in terms of their survival. The only function is to draw attention to themselves, which puts them at risk, but also allows them to find a mate. So Bratz is suggesting, because we tend to think of nature over here and culture over here, these polarized dichotomies, and we tend to bounce back and forth between these poles. We need to be practical and we need to be rational, and we're products of the Enlightenment era with this kind of hierarchical structure of thinking over sensing. And she wants to try to think the two together. To think about how much of our nature is embodied perceiving of the world. What does blue mean to us? So when a scientist studies blue, a scientist is looking at and mapping sound waves. To an artist, blue is a sensation, and it's an excessive kind of overflowing sensation that doesn't serve any practical function other than to tell us that we are here and we are engaged. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of abstraction. And it's really hard to kind of parse out in any of our works how, what is the aspect of my work that has to do with environmental concerns, and what is the aspect of my work that is personal, what is public, what is about art, and what is about these other questions I've had. But I'm going to try to do that. So this is a painting I did right after I moved to Oregon. And my move to Oregon was both a result of a personal need to re-engage, reconnect with the physical world, having lived in New York and on the East Coast for a long time. Being very fulfilled in that environment intellectually, but not in this other way, not viscerally. And wanting to understand how I'm constituted as both biologically given and culturally constructed. So there was this personal pressure to do that, but there was also, at the moment that I started painting, it was at the end of this abstract minimalist, what they call the end game strategy, or the death of painting, where everything had been emptied out of painting except self-reference. So painting about painting about painting. So, pared down to everything, including illusion, so that you just get, for example, a black square. So this is a painting that is attempting to ask questions of, what was lost in that stripping down, and to reintroduce something that brings back, that ties us back to the physical world. So trying to connect my mind to my eye to my body to the world is really a way of saying this. So what these are these little, this is, this kind of creating a slight atmosphere in the skin and the surface of the painting, and then showing these things at this moment of speciation or becoming, or of disappearing. You can look at it either way. So, what happens at this moment when your eye picks up, what is otherwise just an uninflected spot, and you start to read something into it. And, trying to bring the viewer into that fabulous moment that you have in your studio when you make that happen and you actually find something. So not just to finish it, to have it fully realized, but to have it in that process of becoming, which I find very much to be my experience when I'm out in the world, say in nature, walking, and I have this moment when I catch a glimpse of something. I haven't fully named it, but I have a sense of its qualities and its potential. So that's partly what abstraction was for me. The other thing that's happening here is I'm taking my finger and dipping it in paint and putting and just touching the surface of the canvas, the skin of the painting. So painting has this, the reason I haven't given up painting is that it's this kind of exquisitely sensitive membrane upon which you can project all these ideas and all of these sensuous sensations in relation to it. So and it has this incredible history. It's a real physical thing. So I think of the skin of the surface of the painting as being equivalent to the skin of a puddle. So this painting is also being inflected by my experiences in Oregon with all the wet surfaces in the nature, and these shimmering reflective surfaces and the fog and the atmosphere. So all of that kind of physical experience I'm having is creeping into the painting. And so if you think of this as the surface of a puddle or a shiny rock, a wet rock or something, you're seeing what's projected in front, you're seeing what's on, and you're seeing what's behind. So I'm thinking about that kind of complication of space and time, of things becoming, things present, and things leaving. So I started in trying to understand what happens at that moment of perception, which was really my long-term obsession. I started spending lots and lots of time outdoors on my own, just seeing myself sensing and trying to understand how much was me and how much was it. So, for example, I taught myself to go backpacking, and I went on solo backpacking trips because I really think that when there's several of you, it's a triangulated relationship instead of just a one-on-one relationship. And through these experiences, I slowly came to see that it was both. That we have, animals have these search images, right? So a robin has a search image for a worm. So out of all of this whirl of information, it selects certain things to zero in on. And we do as well. And those things that we zero in on are not just physical. They're not just having to do with survival. They're this cultural thing as well. So we have search images that are culturally constructed. All this time spent on my feet in nature and trying to understand what it means to me just as an embodied perceiver. And you notice this kind of shift from the static field to a much more moving field because my sense of landscape is being in it and having it inside of me instead of being outside and removed at this point. So that's part of how these experiences are shifting just my aesthetics. Also noticing that we don't see with rectangles. We see in ovals or circles. So trying to bring that question in, but still referencing modernism as much as this other thing. So really a meeting point between the two. And I won't bore you with all the references to modernism. But also thinking increasingly about how culturally, especially 10 years ago, which is when I did this painting, we tend to think of nature as being a giant resource for technology. And the technology, in turn, hides from us this embodied experience of nature. And so this painting is called Machine Dream. And it's simply an abstract version of these, thinking about the world as this giant and, resource for this engine of technology, which is represented in the center, trying to get these glimpses where this could, of experiences in nature where that could be a cliff or that could be moving water, trying to talk about how when you're in nature, you're actually always inevitably in the center of your world. So it's not in front of you, it's all around you. And trying to find formal decisions that connect to those concepts. I know this is very esoteric, but try to stay with me for a bit. And very self-indulgent, very self-indulgent. I'll talk about that later. This is a piece which again is thinking about that, idea of, and it's a giant oval about this size, and thinking about the skin of the surface of the painting as being equivalent to the surface of water. In this case, a particular surface of water. So I was thinking about the Narcissus, and I was thinking about, which of course has great appeal to painters, because a a is basically a mirror of your idea of the world. And in the history of modernism, it's a very self-involved, self-reflective mirror, and a very narcissistic mirror. And it's also a very narcissistic activity to be a painter. I mean, classically, painters are like holed up in the studio, totally in their heads. And so I'm thinking about that whole construction. And at the same time, I'm reading Dante, and that all gets kind of put in there too with the kind of, let me go to the next slide. So in reflecting on this Narcissus myth, and there's this kind of Russian roulette game going, and you can see the kind of above and below thing. But in thinking about this myth of Narcissus, it's all about this self-involvement, this self-love, and Narcissus, like in being so entranced by himself, actually falls into the water and drowns, right? So, and in my version, there's this idea that if he could shift his gaze from his own image to what's reflected alongside him in the pond, it's the sky, it's the trees, it's nature around him, and that kind of shift from total self-involvement can pull him back into connection to the world, which is actually one of the ways in which I think art does have a role to play in environment, is to kind of reconnect us and show us what it means to us. So this could be this momentary glimpse, just this moment where you slightly catch a glimpse of a cloud reflected on the surface of the water. At the same time, there's this rim that this ball is perilously close to. So it's the kind of, it's both, it's acknowledging both the seduction of self-involvement as well as the danger of it. This is a painting which is a kind of night version of that surface of the pond. And so there's this idea that these could be a constellation of stars, or you could catch a glimpse of water moving or clouds reflected. The question also becomes, are you looking up through this kind of wormhole into the ceiling of the night sky, or are you looking down into water at this kind of, portal or drain? And so there's this kind of flip-flop, mental flip-flop that I'm setting up for the viewer, that I think that painting, and there's this question of, what the heck can you do with abstraction, which is this incredibly formal language that has anything to do with meaning and how people actually, what they can take away from it that can inform their relationship to the world. And I think one thing is, if you think of it as a kind of a practice, the way you would think of yoga as a kind of a practice, in a certain way of okay, so if you think about dance, for example, what a waltz tells you, the way you move in a waltz tells you something very different than what a salsa tells you. If you think about classical music versus jazz, you may come away from those experiences predisposed or reoriented slightly to the world. So I think that art has this way of being a place where you can try out new potentials or flexible ways of thinking or an openness to change. So at this very minimal level, this kind of flip-flop of meaning and inversions of what is it, to me are a kind of very small exercise in this kind of mental flexibility, reinventing your relationship to the world. So this is a more explicit version of that idea of being able, and I'm sorry the colors are a little off here and the light's a little bad, but the idea that there are three languages. There's an illusionistic language of this brushstroke becoming like a pearl of a wave, combined with this abstract expressionist moment, which talks about culture. It's kind of, if this wave is writing kind of the edge between nature and culture, that's more engaged with a cultural reference, whereas something, like that, this moment of this brushstroke becoming, say, dripping water or a cloud or a glimpse of sky or something through the cloud, becomes a sudden shift of things kind of becoming and shape-shifting. So, got through most of that abstract stuff, which is always hard. So this is Ecuador, and this is in the Amazon basin, and this is a fig tree. And if I were standing here, my head, if I were on the other side of this buttress root, my head would be about here. So it's just enormous. And how I found myself in Ecuador is a long journey, which was begun at the time that I decided to leave the East Coast, and just a furthering of that. And so my time down there for the first several years was really just, how to, how to figure out a relationship of who I am, this incredibly, this is no longer my natural environment. What is my relationship to? So, Ecuador is this strange mix of this overwhelming press of biodiversity. Where we go to, my favorite place in Ecuador is Tipitili Biostation, and it is at the epicenter of biodiversity in the planet, according to most people. And so, for example, in an area the size of a football field, there are over 100 different species of trees. Not just 100 different trees, but 100 different species of trees. And on one of those trees, there can be 95 different species of epiphytes. An epiphyte is a plant that grows on a plant. And that doesn't count woody vines and lianas and mosses and things like that. So that's just a plant that grows on a plant. And in each of those plants, there are other organisms that are co-evolved. So it's this incredible, everywhere you look, it's when you first get there, it's just this wall of stuff, this wall of green that takes a long time to develop even search images to kind of differentiate things. At the same time, it's this incredibly remote, to get to Tipitili, it basically takes 24 hours. You fly from Quito to Coca, which is an oil town. You get on a boat and go down the Napo River for several hours, and then you get on a little truck and you go down this gravel road for several hours, and then finally you get on a canoe and go down to Tipitili. It takes a very long time. So when you're there, you have this sense of being in this kind of primal spot. It is, there are jaguars and there are tapirs and there are tons of monkeys, and those are the big things that we love to love, but there's also this overwhelming mass of insects and plants everywhere. And there's also a lot of devastation that's going on with oil development because there's oil there as well. And the devastation comes not so much from the pollution that comes from the oil extraction locally, although that's a big issue as well. But in terms of pressures on biodiversity, it comes from the oil roads that come in to take the oil out. And they come and they cut down the forest and they build a road, and people who have been living in the forest are moved and relocated and not really given the means to much means. And so they do what they can, and they now have guns, so they're able to hunt a lot more. And so there are hunting pressures on mammals, and there's the agriculture is mostly slash and burn. So there's a lot of cultural and biological devastation that follows oil production. So what I do when I'm there is I go out on my own a lot. I hang out with scientists a lot, but I also go out on my own a lot. Again, trying to kind of understand what this means to me in the 21st century. So this is me coming back from a trip up the Tipitini in the dugout. And I'm going to tell you a story that led to this painting. So one of the things I always like to do there, and by the way, I always give this caution, I'm very careful. And I tell people where I'm going, and I take all kinds of precautions. It is dangerous, but so is driving up. So I always like to spend the night alone in the tree canopy, and I don't just cling to a tree. There is a particular place I go to that it's about an hour paddle upriver, and then you hike in a couple of miles, and then there's a large big tree similar to the one I showed you with a ladder leading up to a platform. So this particular evening, about 3 or 4 years ago, when I got there, there was a storm brewing, and I climbed up the ladder, and when I got to the top, it was really windy, and the storm was about to hit, so I tried to quickly set up my pup tent. And the storm passed, and things settled down, and at that moment, it was dusk, so the sun was setting. And I started to look around, because I was done with my survival here. And I slowly became aware that there was this pulsing sound in the forest. And I slowly became aware of this red light on the horizon that was pulsing in the near horizon. And I realized that, here in this epicenter of biodiversity in what is the Yasuni biosphere, it's an international, world biological reserve. They had actually, and they did, sort of sneak in an oil well and an oil refinery. It's right on the edge of the reserve. With this huge plume, this flame that kills, thousands of insects at night because they are attracted to the flame. And this sound permeates the forest and causes stress to the residents. But at this moment, there was, it was really heartbreaking for me. I could no longer maintain even, and intellectually, I've read a lot about environmental philosophy. I know intellectually that, basically there's nowhere to escape technology in this world. There's, we can't go back. It is everywhere. And this fantasy of complete removal or return to some, primal mode. I knew this intellectually, but viscerally, it really got to me at that moment. This, that you couldn't maintain. I could no longer maintain that fantasy, and it really was heartbreaking because it wasn't just me. That was the concern here. And in the morning, I woke up. And in the tree right next to me, probably like where that corner is, that close, was a whole family of Mogsaki monkeys. monkeys, which are incredibly shy monkeys and very easily disturbed. And they were like peeking at me around the tree trunk and the tree limb and looking at me. So I've talked some about my time in nature, looking at nature. But, you know, what's even cooler is when nature looks back at you. But in this particular context, there was this question of, you know, what are you doing here? I mean, clearly they were extremely curious and nervous about my presence. And I felt incredibly implicated, you know, because of the experience the evening before. And it was really a turning point for me that, you know, I felt that I had spent enough time trying to understand for myself in this personal way what happened at this moment of encounter between me and nature. And it was time to shift, you know, my own gaze. And so this painting is about that moment of seeing myself being seen, and it's supposed to be a blend of my eye and the Moksaki eye, which of course is monkeys are our closest ancestors. But you know what? And that summer there was a leak from that refinery. These are images that were smuggled out. There was a cover-up of the leak, and this is the Tipitini River, the river you saw me paddling up, and this is the oil spill, which went downstream really far. So, you know, I did a couple more paintings after this. This is a piece that was trying to, and I actually reworked this. I'll show you an image of it, a close-up of it reworked. Trying to, you know, if you think back to the machine dream, you kind of start to see these illusions of these oil, I think of them as oil pipes, kind of spilling out this crude oil, and I don't want it to look sticky and icky, you know, because it's beautiful too. I mean, it's seductive. I drive a car, you know. And so trying to show that, and then this kind of, I think of this as this kind of wheel of technology, obviously it relates to a hubcap as well, and things kind of caught in the mirror of this metallic surface, so it's no longer a natural surface. And so there's like this kind of fire coming off and becoming this. I think of these have metaphorical meaning for me, so I think of these as the Andes. So it's like the fire or the oil coming up and then moving to the horizon up to North America. But, you know, it's very fashionable right now for a lot of art to be apocalyptic, to kind of talk about our fear and trauma in the face of the global climate crisis. And I'd like to ask me about that later. I'd like to talk about that later. I'm trying to get through this. But I think that often turns people off and actually has the opposite effect because it seems inevitable. I was talking to a scientist, Dale Jamieson, after a talk a couple nights ago. He feels that talking about sheer survival, you know, apocalyptic outcomes in relation to climate change is counterproductive because, well, ask me about that later. So with this painting, you know, I want to say not just, you know, how are we going to survive and how are other creatures going to survive, because it's actually a moral debate. It's not just about us, it's also about the Moksaki monkeys who are subjects of their own perceptual world in their own right. But, you know, what does essentially inflected, rich quality of life, you know, with a biodiverse world mean to us in terms of quality, not just survivorship? So, you know, thinking back to that Gross reading, you know, we are biological creatures and we respond to light and to, you know, plants and to things around us. I mean, they've done studies with hospital patients where they're introduced, you've probably heard about this from other people in this class, where they're introduced to, being able to look outdoors has an incredible effect on their health. So this painting is trying to engage, to remind you of the pleasure of sensory engagement with the world. But at the same time, I felt like this conversation I was having with myself was not sufficient, and so I knew I needed to change my work, and my work is changing. Everything I'm going to show you from this point on is really just in this kind of trial process. When you're down there, I mentioned that there are all these bugs. There's this incredible biomass of insects, and they're always trying to get into your drawings. So I decided I would let them. I would welcome that participation. And so these are a series of drawings that are a result of that. This top one was done by Cephalotes atratus. Sometimes I put little ants in here because I want to set up the viewer to have this search image for a bug, so it not only do the movements of the bug evidence something of the umwelt of the bug, which I'll tell you about in a minute, but it also makes you anticipate. So I think of perception as being anticipating something, not just seeing it, but there's something that anticipates, that pre-selects for you. And so this is where I'm going to pause for a minute to talk about this crazy theory by Jacob von from 1934, who was a scientist who talked about what he called the umwelt of the organism. So it's the world that the organism lives in. And he has a famous, famous for those, he's not famous, but for those who are in the book, he has this great example of a tick. So the umwelt of a tick does not see and it does not hear. It has organs that sense heat and organs that sense movement. And has an exquisite sense of smell, particularly for butyric acid, which is something that mammals excrete. And so what female ticks do is, once they have been fertilized, they have an instinct to climb to the top of a blade of grass and to cling there until they detect butyric acid, so a mammal is walking underneath, at which point they have the instinct to let go, to drop. And then if it's warm, if they sense warmth, they will burrow. And then they will suck blood, and then they will fall off, and the cycle continues. But they can cling to the top of a blade of grass for 18 years, just in this kind of coma, waiting to sense butyric acid. So the umwelt, the kind of sensory world of the tick, is very different from our own. So this question I had of, how is perception constructed in encountering something like a leaf is very different when you think about encountering an organism that is a subject and not just an object. So scientists classically would think of a tick as being a kind of machine, pre-programmed to do these things I just described to you. But if you think of it as its own subject in its own perceptual world, the way we are subjects in our individual perceptual worlds, that's not sufficient, right? That doesn't begin to tell you, how you could possibly understand this creature in this other way. So it's complicated enough to try to understand other human beings, but to try to understand other creatures is particularly difficult. but I'm intrigued by this. And so I'm trying to show in this particular drawing, for example, this is a Cephalotes atratus, show not just the ant, not just as an object, but the ant as being immersed in its own kind of material world. So when I look at a tree, my understanding of the tree, because I am a cultural organism with a very complex umvelt, right? I look at that tree as a symbol, as a scientist, as an artist. I see the hole and I see the card. You know, there's all these different things happening, but to the ant, this is a tree-living ant, it just sees the bark. You know, it knows the bark. And so I'm trying to show that kind of immersion. And I'm also trying to catch, just because I don't think it's just me that is the ant. You know, there's part me and part what the ant brings to the encounter. So I'm trying to show that by the way they're moving. And I'll speed up for a moment. This is actually a lizard moving through things. Get some of that squishy pulp. It's not butter-based. This is a Cephalotes atratus. So let me tell you about this insect, which is a really curious one. The Cephalotes atratus are arboreal ants, meaning they live up in the top of the tree. And when they occasionally fall out of trees. And if they hit the forest floor, they're lost because ants follow pheromone trails, you know, that scent trails, chemical trails. And so, you know, they're lost in this of the forest floor, which is not their natural umbo. So what these ants have done, and this was just discovered a few years ago, is to direct their glide back as they're falling. They don't fly, but they can move out and then back and direct their glide back to hit the trunk of the tree, at which point all they have to do is climb up and they find a scent trail which takes them back to their nest. So in playing with this ant, I just simply, and my methods are very crude, I just have water-based ink here, which they should because they have exoskeletons and they're rainforest creatures, so it just comes off of them and it's just carbon, is all it is. So I would just put it here, and they're about that big. And it kept wanting to go to the soup. And so this is before I knew they were gliding ants, and I would try to move the paper to try to understand what they were doing. And you know, you see this little loop-de-loop here, so you know, it's like, no, I want to go here, and I was trying to thwart it, and then kind of asking a series of questions. And so what it turned out was, so it's a play between me and it. So you know, I'm responding to it, and it's responding to my movements. And what it turned out was it was directing itself to the brightest corner of where I was. Trying to find, because tree trunks are the most reflective plane in the understory of the forest. And so that's how it actually finds the tree trunk, is because there's more light there. So it was trying to find its way home, basically. This is a picture of, I guess I don't have the control. I had, you know, sometimes I feel guilty because I'm like putting them in ink for a few minutes. But these guys drop them off of trees, you know, and they like blind them. They do all kinds of things. This is a friend of mine, Tom Wallach, and he's helping me collect insects. You can see how dark it is in the understory. He's got this shit-eating grin because he's not doing science. He's doing stuff. The scientists actually love this stuff because they can't express this real attachment, this real feeling they have for this stuff. Their language is very precise, and it doesn't allow them to talk about, you know, their excitement about it. And so they love the fact that art can do that. You know, at first I wasn't sure what they would think of this goofy stuff I was doing, but they actually love it. And I'm now collaborating with a physicist at U of O who's loaning me ants, so I have a sub-colony in my studio, and helping me understand how to control them. But this is before that happened. Here's a Cephalotes atratus drawing in an ink drawing of itself. And I thought it was curious the way it was kind of extending its legs, and then it started dragging its abdomen here. And so, I thought about it. Well, it's trying to become a winged insect, and so I kind of helped the drawing. So it's becoming a wasp. The next summer, I went down with these little Dutch boy paint samples, which I loved when I saw them in Home Depot because they look like little minimalist paintings. So, think back to that early black painting I showed you. So I brought these down and I introduced them to a bunch of leafcutter ants. So these leafcutter ants are walking along the edge of this wood trail, and they've been there for years. Leafcutter ant highways extend for really far. and so this is them walking, and I would simply drop some ink. And, they're busy, so at first they're like, ooh, but then they get used to it, and they just start walking through it. And I start playing with it, turning it, if it needs to be turned, or finding a relationship between two panels that then I move close together. This is an early version of what now is almost covered with these little drawings that I brought back and slowly, and I'm doing some now with domestic ants and with, they're not domestic, but they're these hybrid ants that come from the physics lab, so they're like cultured ants. Anyhow, so I have all these little pieces that kind of find relationships on this wall. This is alongside of that wall, and this is a list of, this is just one page of about 10, listing all of the species of ants in Ecuador. And this is an ant drawing on the edge of it, done by a bullet ant. So here, let's see. This is a pair, so sometimes I forget, I have to read it myself. So carpenter ants and leafcutter ants from Yasuni. This is done by a bullet ant. So bullet ants are really fun to play with because you can direct them around the page by putting your hand close to it. They're the most they are the most toxic insect in the world. I mean, they're called bullet ants because when they sting you, they feel like a bullet. And I was really worried about them, playing with them for a while, because I knew a Warani who said that he had been in bed for 2 days with hallucinations and shaking and fever after being stung. But I did play with them, and they love, part of it is the ink blot, so I'm also playing with this kind of construction, this playful construction, almost like a Rorschach ink blot test. And so the ink is performing, the art materials are performing. If you think back to those earlier paintings, I thought of them as though, your encounter with paint is like your encounter with nature. So you can walk in them the way you walk in landscape. So the ink's performing, the bugs are performing, my imagination is performing, and it all comes together in these crazy things. So bullet ant, and then this reminded me of camouflage. So this was done by a leafcutter ant. So this is I call this camouflage. And so it's like the leafcutter camouflaging itself because they're afraid of bullet ants too. And then, of course, when you're thinking about bugs, sometimes you see these bugs in these things. Sometimes you see kind of human hybrid creatures. And I don't keep most of them. I keep the ones that appeal to me. So again, this to me is this kind of cartoony bug that is as much about the ink and the paint as it is about the bug. Sometimes they're three-dimensional and playing a role with language to suggest, so you don't see this, which is buggy, behind this kind of thing that suggests turf until you come around and look, and it's like, oh, there's something there. Bullet ant, leafcutter ant. Figure 8. I see this as being an ant, but also being a figure 8. And I recognize this as a figure 8 because this predisposes me to, right? So we don't have a natural passive construction, when we perceive things. It's always set up. It's always pre-mediated. So that's what I'm trying to bring out. This was actually made by fruit flies at a time when, does anyone remember Sarah Palin talking about fruit fly research? She went into this, she made this statement about how awful it was that we were spending millions of dollars on fruit fly research, which actually has led to all kinds of breakthroughs medically. So I decided to do a little bit of my own fruit fly research. So this is fruit flies like walking through a wet photograph and spreading it in this configuration. I also have studio visitors that come in. So this big bug came in, and he spent hours hanging out on this. This is actually, what do you call it, board trim, staring at these, which were just like, so he was like here, and these were like, and it was like he was watching a drive-in movie or something, staring for hours at these. And I think, there's like, he was seeing himself. And then he crawled further up, and he fell in love with this ink blot. And I think because there's, this is the same color, this is the same shape, and he's thinking, well, maybe. And so I took this image, which I paired with this image, in which I see these kind of heads with long necks. And I called it the autobiographical animal to point out how we're always predisposed, as is the bug, to see ourselves in things. So, we're always inescapably somewhat autobiographical. More fruit fly research. This was actually an image of an ant, and somehow they moved through it, and gravity served to kind of spread. So to me, it's like becoming this other creature. Okay, so now I'm taking these small-scale paintings, and I'm doing small-scale, ant paintings, and doing large-scale paintings based on that. So that painting is based on this one. I'm also doing some landscapes with the eyes of the landscapers, but I'm not ready to talk about this. And again, I apologize. I took this with my iPhone before I came. So, don't do as I do. Be professional. So this is a really large-scale painting where I'm trying to animate the painting itself. So the Dutch boy stripes. I'm trying to animate the ink blot, so I saw this as this kind of dancing R, and I'm trying to heighten that. And I'm trying to animate, I think I have, the mark. So it's not sufficient to me to just copy what the ant has done. I have to, kind of have it be equal parts nature and culture. So, referencing abstract expressionism as much as everything else, and then the kind of the messiness of the ink and the paint flying and taking off, and this kind of strange frozen brushstroke in the background. Another one where the ink blot itself in particular, I'm thinking of it as being this animated creature walking back into this big spiraling cloud. And to do these things, I had to, because I knew I needed a different aesthetic. I had to give up oil paint and years of technical proficiency with oil to learn acrylic, to figure out a tool to make this background, to learn airbrushing, to try to get this kind of popish quality. which I'm still getting better at. This is kind of the ink becoming the ant becoming the ink, this exchange. And so now I'm doing a collaborative project with, these are ants being studied by a physicist at U of O who studies them because of the metals in their jaws that they absorb to have their mandibles be as sharp as razor blades. And he lets me come in and play with them, and he's also given me a sub-colony I have in my studio. This is them moving through their tubes. That's them feeding their fungus. They cut leaves, but they don't actually eat the leaves. The leaves they chew up and feed to these fungus, which are what they eat. It's kind of crazy. So I'm trying to figure out, I got a grant to capture all of, not all, but a huge quantity of tracks of leafcutter ants next time I go to Tipitini. And I'm trying to figure out, I don't like the ink so much. I'm trying to find out something that will give me more nuance. And so here I'm smoking petri dishes. So these are ant tracks. And this ant was dropped with a leaf, and then it like scooted off. And you can see its movements are a lot bolder than these, which are ants that just came to feed on this apple. And to me, it looks kind of like a night sky or something. I don't know if I will do something with this technique, but it certainly gives me more. This is a whole group of them having fed on an apple. So it gives me a little more nuance, and maybe I'll do something with a leaf cutter with those, but we'll see. Anyhow, that's the work. So I'm happy to take questions. I lived that image you were just looking at is actually, I lived my last sabbatical, I lived on the side actually of an active volcano. And so every night you could see it spewing out smoke, and it was always very spooky in the middle of the night when you could feel the earth trembling, but there was cloud cover and you couldn't see it. And that statue was the town's attempt to think of ways to control the volcano. Did I say tornado? Sorry, I might volcano. So there's this, part of me is acknowledging that at a certain level we do construct nature. But part of me is also saying, but wait a minute, it's not all us. And so there are other things that are at risk in global climate change, and other things that are beyond our control. And it seems egotistical for us to think otherwise. So I don't know. What do you all think? Do you think that that art has a role to play in the environmental crisis? Yeah.
Well, I like how you say that, like the scientists, they're really smart and they really can observe a lot, but they have no way of expressing their emotions. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed that, and that scientists really get excited, like, oh wow, look at how you're representing this kind of thing. Fearing something, like this is a totally different way.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that is that it reminds us that we care. It reminds us that it means something to us, and it reminds us, about the differences. I think that's what I'm particularly trying to do. But I think the other part of that is that they recognize, because they report all the time that species have become extinct or are on the brink of extinction, and they're totally frustrated because no one seems to care. Because if it doesn't seem urgent in relation to our need to survive, especially now with the emphasis on climate change, they get when practical reasons fail, we need to fall back on something else. And that is, what do we value? And not just how do we survive, but, what is the quality of our lives after survival? And maybe that's something that art is particularly positioned to tell us. But it's a much slower process, right?
You say that's the result of the difference in objectivity and subjectivity in art and science. Science tries to be very objective, whereas art is almost entirely subjective.
Right. I don't mean to polarize them. I know lots of scientists who are very creative and, who speak compellingly about these things. But when they publish, that's not where their voice is. So we can give voice to that. But we can also remind ourselves. Here in Oregon, we live a little closer to knowing, experiencing what changes in weather, stuff as simple as that. But lots of people in, the first world, who are the ones doing all the damage, don't. They simply don't. The virtual world is just fine. So, I said earlier that I think of it as a kind of practice that, not one painting, particularly painting, for Christ's sake, is going to shift us, but cumulatively, just like giving voice, paying attention, stopping, sharing a little conversation like this about it. I mean, part of how I think my art can function environmentally, in this very modest way, is to, when I have an opportunity to talk about my work, I can tell you something about Ecuador, and I can try to say something about, reminding us of where we come from. Yeah.
I'm curious in terms of the format of your two bodies of work.
Yeah.
The first one, you use kind of like spherical or round ones, and you paint it to the edge of all the canvases. And the second one, both in field work in terms of letting the ants or the insects do their work, and then your interpretation of that is either it's more of a polymemoric thing, and you have a lot of negative space. So they seem so both of them were very deliberate or great. Is there something there that which it seems
I think first of all I'm giving up authorship to an extent when I invite the insects to become co-authors, I guess, and I'm more of an editor than a producer. And then I think about, like, spatially, the reason there's so much negative space in, like, that R painting is because I want to animate the painting itself, and so I'm pulling it back and kind of distorting it within the frame instead of filling the frame, because when you fill the frame, you just move into it. It doesn't, it's not a thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So you sort of made this comment about needing a new aesthetic.
About what?
Feeling that you needed a new aesthetic. And I'm curious if you could sort of unpack that.
About the needing and the aesthetic.
Like why
I'm not sure I'm there.
Yeah.
I'm this. Well, partly, I guess I'm part of it, and I'm sorry I spent so long with all that abstract stuff at the beginning. I wasn't going to show any of that, and then I thought, well, it's hard for me to give up this long conversation I've had with painting and abstraction because I felt it took a wrong turn.
Your own work or the field?
The field. And so I was trying to kind of turn slowly, like this ship, back to the physical world. And then I guess I just got bored with that, or maybe I just, it was like the imperative of all these experiences I was having, and I think that's why it was not just this encounter with the Monksaki monkeys, but that was this moment where, it was just like, It can't just be, you know, an intellectual, private conversation. And I wanted to make some of. So there were a lot of decisions driving the paintings that actually came from reflecting on issues about embodiment, about nature and culture, about perception, but I wanted to convey them more clearly to people, not just to myself. And so that you know, kind of put me in this corner where I had to find something, you know, to break out of that private conversation.
So I think that's interesting. That starts to get at the question you posed, right, which has to do with the role of art and social
Right.
issues. There's a key thing you're talking about, which has to do with the relationship to authors.
Yeah.
And that you've made a shift. You're so concerned about what it's going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, do you guys consider yourselves artists? Yeah. Okay. We were so wondering. But you know, I think you first have to have like a really good, rich, honest conversation with yourself through the work. But that's not the end point. That's like, you know, like necessary. And then beyond that, you know, I think we really do care about sharing that. And so I was really uncertain about my own private conversation. I spent years just kind of, you know, working on it. And again, you never do it. You never totally do it. It's like there's always something somewhere else to go. And I'm not sure this is directly answering your question. I think it just started feeling self-indulgent again. And I think, you know, finding myself in an interdisciplinary setting helped me step outside of this kind of, you know, cave that I was in, and pushed me to you know, find other ways of thinking about what I was doing and to set aside some of my paradigms. And so now I've done, you know, besides the stuff I've showed you that has to do with shifting my practice and getting ideas from scientists and getting help from scientists. And what I really want to do with this last project is to do something that evidences in a more particular way what this organism is doing. You know, to connect to that, the biology more. I'm doing things like proposing grants with computer intelligence people, and I'm, you know, teaching courses with people in literature and philosophy about environmental issues, and all of that is completely stretching me, and it all comes back into the work. You know, so this, what I was trying to convey, and I'm not sure I successfully did it in the early part of my talk, you know, where I was talking about my time spent just, you know, backpacking and stuff, was it's this feedback loop between what I'm doing physically and personally and thinking culturally, what happens in the work and how that, you know, then predisposes me. So when I'm, you know, backpacking, I'm thinking about my art a lot of times, you know, as much as I am looking around. So it all, I don't know, it all gets in there. And so I think for me that there was, you know, Colin asked me to talk about this a little bit, and I, you know, I've been like a painter's painter for most of my life, and this idea that I might collaborate on a piece or shift the way I went about things happened at a, Frances had a faculty meeting where she had a panel of people there to talk about interdisciplinary collaboration. And I've always been like, you know, solo person. And I thought, well, I can't picture myself doing that. But at the same time, I was feeling this pressure to give voice to these other concerns and to do something. And so, you know, I had started to be more of an activist in terms of, you know, working with organizations involved in biodiversity down in Ecuador and oil stuff. But, I started saying, well, okay, so if I were to do this, I could see myself doing something interdisciplinary around something like an idea, something that was a pressing concern or idea. I could see different people coming together around this, because this is a big problem. It's not going to be solved just in green building or just in, crazy stuff with ants, or, it's a big problem that we all have a part to play in. And I think in AAA, we're beginning to, the art department is now beginning to see that hey, so many of us are doing work, Colin is doing work, other people are doing work that is about trying to understand our relationship to nature. Not necessarily to change it, it's not the applied stuff, but that's still really important because we're experiencing it as a culture. We're not just experiencing it in terms of how we physically live our lives. There's trauma involved, there's, changes that need to come from our values. So, cultural values impact environmental policy. And, yeah.
I had a question. When you were doing the drawings that the ants were kind of helping you with, I don't know if you've had as much of a chance for audience in these works, but have you noticed that people started perceiving this perception of the Umwelt in that drawing?
I don't know.
Do you know if it's maybe stronger in the ones that you were doing of those drawings?
What do you think? You tell me.
I'm interested in knowing what the results were.
It's a scientist. I haven't done a survey. I don't know. What do you all think?
Well,
where did you get a sense of the Umwelt?
What fascinates me with what you showed before in your more abstract work is that there was this attention to like that moment where you start perceiving something that was not originally intended, or seeing something else that maybe you were not showing explicitly in the drawing, but somebody else might find a meaning in it. Mm-hmm. And I think that same principle kind of carries over into these drawings with the ants, and seeing, the kind of gestures that the ants make, is maybe seeing something more out of it. And I think that your new set of drawings, which are representations of them, kind of a mixing of the two worlds, I think that has a lot of potential, and I want to know how it has impacted people. So I think it's important.
Yeah, well, I haven't shown it to a lot of people. They seem to get it. I mean, they just intuitively get it, and I think that this idea of the Umwelt tells us that we really can't know. It's like part of what we project and part of what comes the other direction that we encounter and get a glimpse of. And that glimpse or that sense is really, nonverbal, subliminal stuff, which is why I think I've been so invested in abstraction, because it refuses to explain. It refuses the pretense of explanation. I mean, I can tell you all about the ant. It doesn't give you the sense of the ant. In some ways, it gets between you and having a sense of the ant. So, that's how I think of the abstraction in relation to that idea. And of course, this idea of the Umwelt, has other resonating and exfoliating implications between, people, human to human, but between methodologies. So the Umwelt of a scientist is, diagrams, and the Umwelt of an artist or a musician, a musician is not studying waves, it's sound. And so, it's very hard to understand one another across these barriers, but you can get a glimpse.
What I also like about this just notion of the Umwelt is that there's there becomes like a perception of something other than your vision, your point of view.
Yeah.
Just whatever form that would take.
Yeah. And it's, it's kind of like that, that painting where I talked about the flip-flopping of above and below. So it's like you shift your perception, I mean, to just go, oh, this is not us. This is like really different from us, this Oomba, is important because, so I told you I wanted to talk about Dale Jameson's comments a little bit. And in relation to the apocalypse. And what he is saying is that that thinking of it in terms of sheer survival is counterproductive because first of all, it freaks people out and it freezes them from action. Secondly, for most of us in North America, it's not going to be apocalypse. People will move, people will adapt, things will be harder, like we want. For, people in Africa, in developing nations, it's going to be truly apocalyptic. And yet they're not the ones that have to change their behaviors, right? So he insists that that a moral sense, developing a moral sense about change, not just, oh, if we don't do something, we're going to burn up, because once that kind of, frightening, that nightmare, is kind of resolved, and we see that we're not, burning up or floating away, it's going to be a matter of qualitative changes. It could be this bad or it could be that bad. And who is being affected becomes an issue, and what is being affected. And so having values about not just saving your own skin, but caring about, other species and other people in the world that are being impacted is really, how we need to ultimately resolve this. And actually, they've done, when he was talking about this, I was remembering an example I heard, like in Ecuador. This is where, I don't know, it's probably not so cool to take all these metaphors from science, but I can't help it. So there was a bat guy, expert, talking about vampire bats and talking about altruistic behavior in vampire bats. So vampire bats, when they need to drink blood every day. If they don't, they die. And they can't always be successful in finding blood. And so in a group of vampire bats, they regurgitate blood to a member of the group that has not had sufficient blood. And that way everybody gets a little blood and more people tend to survive. So that Dawkins idea is not just that this is intentional behavior, but the fact that that individual survived, ensures that its genes have survived. But they only do it if they are not themselves starving. Okay, so altruistic behavior in vampire bats, and this is true of monkeys, and the studies with monkeys, and we're monkeys. Altruistic behavior only happens when it's not too much of a cost, when your own survival is at risk. And so, Gross, the reason Gross is interesting to me is because she suggests that at least some of our behavior is, deeply motivated. We're mid-sized creatures, who only see this world as this mid-sized world. We don't tend to see things way across the planet, and we tend to behave still in ways that, at least at some level, are informed by this kind of imperative to survive and this imperative to reproduce. And so kind of freeing yourself from this apocalyptic thinking maybe allows me to be more altruistic.
Great. That's
Okay, well,
That's a
thank
great-
you.
I like ending on a popular.
Yeah. One of these days, one of these days I'm going to do a talk about the abstract. I'm not quite ready to do it.
That's great. I think the show has a full trajectory is excellent.
Yeah, it's really Well, it's just hard to kind of plunge into the later stuff and have it not look just very.
But there is obviously a thread. Like, you know, you said you moved out to Oregon, you started backpacking all over the place, doing these solo hikes, and you know, there obviously is a thread that's